Ineffable, Language, as case studies, Henri Bergson. In this presentation, I will be exploring an intersection between philosophy, linguistics, and literature, particularly how these two French thinkers see the relationship between language and what we might call ineffable, or might call it the inexplicable, the inexpressible, not the inexpressible. The central questions we are discussing here are, can language surpass what it cannot express? Can language express the inexpressible? Can language ever truly capture our feelings, innermost feelings, and most subjective experiences? Or does it inevitably distort those feelings, experiences? Okay. Before I get into Paul Valéry and Henri Bergson, I have to make it. I decided at the beginning to remove this section altogether, but when I finished, I said a serious part of my research is missing, because we should understand what I mean by the word transcendence and what I mean by the word ineffable in this particular context. So I will focus on those two concepts. Secular, I guess it is generally a well understood word. Here I'm using it with the three meanings like séculier, laïque, peut-être séculaire. Séculier with the religious intonations of the word, laïque with the political intonations of the word, and secular, just for a joke, yeah, it's happening once every century. Now, transcendence. Transcendence, it is a big and a large topic, but I will concentrate on just a few points to give you a general idea about what concerns us in this study of Bergson and Valéry. In linguistics, transcendence, the word comes from transcendere or transcendere, the Latin word, trans and scandere. Trans means beyond, scandere to climb. So generally it means to climb over something. With the how shall I say, the figurative meaning of going beyond the limits of something, whether they are physical limits or figurative limits. So the most fundamental meaning here is surpassing what is ordinary, surpassing all the limits or states of being beyond normal perception or experience. Here, this is I'm being very particular here, because going beyond perception and going beyond experience and going beyond ordinary limits. The quality of extending beyond usual boundaries, pragmatically the term here, also I have to say, the word transcendence, when we usually use it in most of the context, it carries with it a positive and ameliorative connotation. So it is usually related to spirituality, to moral transcendence. We usually have that positive baggage with it. We rarely, I have never come across of the use of the word transcendence in a negative meaning. If you have, I would be glad to see that. So now I will talk about transcendence in three main domains: linguistics, religion, and philosophy. Why I have concentrated on these three domains? Because they are interacting in Bergson and Valéry. You cannot see them clearly, but you can find traces of them between the lines. Linguistics, here I talk about the idea of reference and displacement. How language, in several ways, can refer to objects and concepts that are not physically present in the same time, in a particular moment, allowing us to discuss the past, the future, hypothetical situations, or even going to a higher degree of abstract ideas. The signifier here transcends itself. The signifier, like when we say tree, T-R-E-E, in English, arbre in French, shajara in Arabic. So these are signs. But what do they signify? This is what transcendence. Language transcends those sounds, those forms we write on pieces of paper that are usually meaningless without that transcendence. So transcendence is something inherent in language. The signifier, the sign transcends to the signifier. Or the signifier transcends itself, actually. The word goes beyond the physical form, blah, blah, blah. And then I want also to point to something very important about that Habermas introduced, contextual transcendence. This contextual transcendence is like when we say, for example, the sky is blue. The sky is blue, this statement, or the validity of this statement transcends every context. It is valid in Britain, in Turkey, in America, in the 19th century, well, in the 1st century BC, and will be valid most probably in the future. We don't know if it will remain blue or not, but generally this is what we mean by contextual transcendence. When certain statements, or the validity of certain statements, or the truthness of certain statements transcend certain specific context. And now we move to religion. In religion, we want to talk about generally three main points. First, what we mean by transcendence is divine transcendence. The idea that God, or the divine, or the sacred, according to different traditions, exists wholly separate from and independent of the material world. So the total separation, the total and whatever you call it, is totally independent, totally separate from the material world, from the creation. Again, you call it whatever you call it. And then transcendence, so here, yeah, it is also important. We have transcendence outside or beyond the categories and the limitations. It cannot be categorized, and it cannot be limited into space or time or whatever limitation the human brain can construct. In Eastern traditions, we have a specific nuance in the meaning. The meaning of transcendence here means the liberation from the cycle of rebirth or reunion, the absolution of samsara, or yeah, when we talk, particularly when we talk about nirvana, or in Sufism al-fana, or whatever. So these concepts are all related to transcendence. And transcendence can be realized in this particular context of Eastern traditions, or also some Sufi or mystical traditions, and the mystical union with the absolute. So when we talk about transcendence, we talk about a union with what is absolute. Again, you call it God, you call it the sacred, you call it the absolute. You have to choose a name according to the traditions you are studying. But there is a mystical union. When I say mystical union, it means that it is non-discursive, non-linguistic union. It is a union, it is a long debate for another day. And again, when we talk about this absolute transcendence, we must also talk about the word immanence, transcendence versus immanence. And again, this is a great philosophical, Sufi, religious about is God present everywhere, or is God separate from everywhere? The problem, I guess, we talked about in the last session about Impressionism. Yeah, the doctor yesterday we discussed from Iran, I guess, we discussed Impressionism. So he was talking about pantheism. Exactly. Immanence has much to do with pantheism, because pantheism means God is everywhere. Immanence means God is present within its creation, or within the material world. Transcendence is the absolute opposite of that in this strict meaning. Now I move directly to transcendence in philosophy. In philosophy, I will talk about 4 types of transcendence: metaphysical transcendence, existential transcendence, epistemological transcendence, and lately we have been talking about a certain postmodern transcendence. Metaphysical transcendence, I will go quickly here because it is taking too long. Metaphysical transcendence, like Kant or Aquinas or Kant, for example, here these have notions of this metaphysical transcendence. Like Plato, he talks about the realm of forms. So those forms transcend the realm of the copies, which is our world. Or Aquinas is scholastics and the Christian view of the world, God as separate from the world. Kant, I should make a particular point here, but I don't want to get into the details. Kant makes the difference between transcendent and transcendental. So transcendent is not the transcendent. I'm here talking about the transcendent, not the transcendental, which means that, but again, Kant is not like Plato. Kant said that the transcendent is something that cannot be known. So it is out of the reach of our experience. We cannot know it. This is, we call it transcendent. Existential transcendence. Here we call the names of Heidegger, and the idea that, or Sartre, also Sartre, the idea that the self can reach a potential outside of its present situation or present condition. So it has much to do with the self and its potential in the future or in the present. Epistemological transcendence, again, is like what we can reach by the through cognition, according to Kant, or through the knowledge of the self, through what Descartes says. Okay, now postmodern transcendence relocates transcendence from metaphysical beyond to the other. Like here, I would take the example of Levinas. He deferred let me start with Derrida. Derrida took the idea of transcendence from the metaphysical world to the idea that no, there is no metaphysical world we are going to war about. Meaning is always deferred. This is how transcendence of the material, the physical meaning of the signifier, the sign. That sign transcends itself by having no stable meaning. Everyone, you and me and you and you and you, every one of us can have their own meaning. Today we can have different meanings. Tomorrow, or just the next second, we can have another meaning. So meaning is always deferred. We can never have a stable, clear set meaning. From this, I will move. So this was the summary of the metaphysical, existential, epistemological, and postmodern perspectives on transcendence. I will move directly to the ineffable. The ineffable, ineffables, or the ineffability, I guess. The Latin word. Let me check. Ineffabilis. Effabilis is the verb, is to speak out, to say something loudly. And in the opposite note, so something that cannot be said out, something that cannot be expressed with the use of language, whether written or spoken, of course. The most important part about the ineffable is there is a breakdown of the abilities of language, a failure, a semantic failure of language. The signifier cannot point sufficiently to the signified. For example, when I say cup, well, the words or the characters C-U-P, these sounds, cannot give you a full meaning of what I mean by cup. It can be a glass cup, it can be a big cup, it can be, you see what I mean? This is just a very simple meaning. But the signifier fails to give the meaning of the signifier, fails to refer to the signifier, to the signified. Alors, the ineffable in philosophy is a particularly nuanced. We talk about what cannot be grasped by conceptual thought. This is the ineffable. It is what cannot be said in language, but cannot be also conceptualized in our thought. You can feel it, for example, but we cannot conceptualize it. I will move, I guess, directly into the ineffable in religion because it is important. The ineffable appears most prominently in mystical experiences because here we talk about direct encounters with the divine or the ultimate reality are consistently described as ineffable across religious traditions. Mystics, here, this is what I wanted to point you. Mystics resort to paradox, poetry, metaphor. Why? To gesture toward that which cannot be directly stated into language. So what do they use? These essays. They use paradox and parables and poetry and figures of speech to express something that normal language cannot express. And this is directly linked to Bergson and Valéry because their key point is poetry. Okay, now Bergson and Valéry. With Bergson, yes. We start with Bergson. This is an introduction about Bergson, but I guess before talking about this, I will just give you an idea about it. He was born in 1859 and died in 1941, which means that he lived at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. What characterizes this period is two things. More than two things, but I will just focus on two things because there are too many things. The idea of all of, I guess you know this better than me, the idea of positivism, scientific language, and all that, but also romanticism, idealism, those ideas that were rising and were boiling in the intellectual arena of the 19th century and the later 19th century, the birth of sociology, the birth of the this new way of thinking, the separation of sociology from literature, and the beginning of a new trend of thinking and a new way of writing. And there is something very specific about the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century when it has to do with language. It is the beginning or the earliest beginning of the linguistic terms in the social science. Here, and I guess I will talk about Gottlob Frege, who is the father, so to speak, of analytic philosophy. What did Frege propose at the very beginning? He said that all philosophical problems are at their core linguistic. So to solve our philosophical problems, we need to solve language. And then he said language, guys, can be very scientific, using very strict logical bases and methodologies. He said we can create a neutral language that can express every single thought we want. Bergson seems, I guess, very unhappy with this. How can language be neutral? How can language be just a medium? I guess I need to open a bracket here. Just to give you a very general idea about this problem of language and thought, language and culture, because this research was actually at the beginning part of my literature review. I conducted a study of the relationship, all the philosophies and the thoughts that had to do with the relationship with language, thought, and culture from ancient Egyptians to the 21st century. When I came to the 19th century, and I have to thank Rojan, actually, because I have never heard of Bergson beyond just general ideas before I took his wonderful 2 courses. He introduced me to Bergson, and he gave me a window to understand the change that happened during that century, the end of that century and the beginning of the 20th century. The Egyptians believed in the Levite theology and all that. Then there was Plato, Aristotle, then the Renaissance. And we came to the 19th century and we are in a crisis. Can language express everything? Or is language distorting everything? Or can language have a magical power like it had during the Egyptian time, the ancient Egyptian times? Bergson, and this is what I will show here, had his ideas like I'm citing Erwin Edmund here, from the Dionysian religious mysteries. And these are in some ways, or in many ways, linked to the Levite theology from what I have studied. They are really linked to the ancient Egyptians meant by theology in a few words is the mythology that describes how the word was the beginning of creation of the world. So the ocean spoke, and I'm just using this ocean, it's not the ocean, it's the water and all of that, but everything was created by the word. And in magic, words have the power to create. So when you say words in certain orders with certain intonations, you can change reality. This is the idea. Bergson had that idea, but he brought it in a new emballage. He presented it in a new way. Let us read. He had this idea of the élan vital from the Dionysian religious mysteries, ancient Greece, the mystical aspect of his ideas to Plotinus. You know Plotinus and the one and the mystical philosophy, and romantic elements or romanticism of the 19th century, and German idealist philosophers, idealism of the 18th and 19th century, and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau, so Fichte, Schelling, and that's it. Now, let us come to the core of this. What did Bergson think about language? The first thing we need to take from this lecture, or take from this presentation, is that we had an opposition between two realities. The reality of our experience and our feelings, which is ever-changing. Here, you know, you have the background very well, the long duration, intuition, and all that makes our subjective personal experience ever-changing. So thought and experience are never stable. For him, on the other hand, language is rigid. Language is stable. So it imposes its stability, stagnation on the word, on the feelings, on the experiences, on the thoughts. So the very tools we create to express our fluid experience end up constraining and rigidifying that experience. Second point is that language fragments reality. And here I call you back to duration. When you say that the past, the future, and the present are a continuity, our thoughts are the same, are a fluid continuity. But language, like a bad teacher, whatever, cuts everything in the middle of the hat and whatever, and gives you a very distorted idea of those feelings and those ideas and those experiences. The third thing, I guess, is so these words, as soon as they were formed, would turn against the sensation that gave birth to them, and invented the, I'm putting here Bergson, and invented to show that the sensation is unstable. They would impose on it their own stability. So this recapitulates the idea of stability versus rigidity. Okay. If you want, I guess I will pass this. Yeah, individuality and uniformity. This is, I can recapitulate this in one sentence. Human experience is very subjective, but language uniformalizes that experience. It just like makes every single one in this room has very unique and nuanced thinking, experiences, feelings, ways of seeing the world, perceptions of reality. But when you put that perception of reality into the mold of language, it makes it uniform, because the mold, like the water in a cup, water can take many shapes, but when you put it in one set form, in one set mold, it takes the form of that mold. So it is uniform, it is generalized. Okay, language plays a crucial role in shaping, in the sense that you want to shaping, in the sense of limiting our thoughts and perception. This is how I understood Bergson, actually. I didn't find any particular way when he said this, but this is the fruit I got from what I have read of his ideas. Here I can draw your attention to The Tragedy of Culture by Zimel. who said figurative culture, in a nutshell, is that objective culture and subjective culture are in opposition, and subjective culture is being dominated by objective culture. Look, for example, at chamber assembly industries. For example, we have many laptops of the same marks, so we are being uniform, we are being like molded in similar shapes and forms to cooperate with this objective culture, with this mass media, mass culture. You have the same idea, but just bear in mind the tragedy of culture when the subjective culture is being dominated over by the objective culture. And the objective culture, you can take it the political level, the religious level, whatever level you wish, or the generally cultural level, with culture as a broad word that includes economy, politics, religion, personal life, media, whatever. And the culture industry here, I'm making reference to Adorno and Horkheimer, of course, where, again, mass culture controls the artistic singularity of the person. What is the solution for that? Bergson proposes that there should be violence. And I am taking the word here from Bergson himself and from another study I found very interesting, Hisashi Fujita, who said that Bergson employed two kinds of violence. Violence against reality, experience, and violence that is creative. So that first violence is what language creates against reality. Language fragments reality, language generalizes personal experience, language compartmentalizes, or you can say just banalizes personal experience. And then there is creative violence. That creative violence is what interests us here, because it is the creative violence that a very singular author has the ability to exercise over language, using metaphors, using figurative speech, to create a language out of language, to make the sensation live in language. And he said, not everybody can do that. Otherwise, we would all of us be novelists and poets and artists, and we are not all of us like that. So this creative violence aims to capture the reality that ordinary language distorts by employing metaphors, analogies, and so on and so forth. I am quoting him here. Now there is another method of composition, more ambitious, less certain. It consists in working back from the intellectual and moral plane to the point in the soul from which there springs an imperative demand for creation. So he focuses on the idea of creation. So like when you say creative revolution, you have creative violence. You should exercise violence to be able to be creative. And the writer will attempt to realize the unrealizable. So this is the process, which is known in Bergsonism, the process of realization through language, through poetical language, let us say. He will revert to the simple emotion. He will be driven to strain the words. He do violence to speech. That's it, the second violence. What else? So Bergson serves as a process of realization. And here we see the ineffable and transcendence. So how transcendence can happen according to that? Transcendence can happen only through that linguistic violence. Here we have traces of that linguistic transcendence, traces of that religious transcendence, but it is, as the German philosopher calls it, Gottlose Mystik, a godless mysticism. So we have a mysticism, we don't have the notion of God or the sacred. It is linguistic, it is personal, it is subjective. It expresses the ineffable. And what is the ineffable according to Bergson? The ineffable according to Bergson is those singular subjective feelings and experiences, and even inner thoughts. So we pass that. He sees language, or he sees, I removed that. He sees poetry as a third mode. This is important, just to be clear. We have, okay, a third mode of apprehending reality different from the approaches of science and philosophy. So he said we have the language of science and we have the language of philosophy. He said, why are we limiting ourselves to philosophy and science? There is poetry, guys. We should look up there. Maybe you can find something better. And this is what he does. He says that the language of poetry, and I guess maybe this is why he got the Nobel Prize of Literature. We should look back into poetry. And I guess this is something very peculiar. We can combine the exactitude of science with the open-mindedness and the questioning nature of philosophy, with the creativity of poetry. I guess this is a very peculiar proposition by Bergson. Okay, realization, blah, blah, blah. Okay, Paul Valéry. Paul Valéry was born a little bit later than Bergson, and he has a similar yet different idea. They both say that there is an ineffable in our language, in our experiences, right? But he also concentrates on the power of poetry. What he says is the opposite of what, not the opposite, but he takes another angle, he takes another perspective from Bergson. He says that language is essentially provisional. What do you mean by provisional? He said that language is changing. Language is not stable. My dear Bergson, you talk about the stability and the rigidity of language, but I say language is like, I'm quoting Valéry, fiat money. Fiat money is like paper money. Here, words like I will want that. 10 minutes of simple considering one, not that, but two. Let me find that. Yes, this is a very visual code. I love Valéry when I read this. Yeah, he's a bright guy. But how can we think if we consider language to be essentially provisional? As provisional as a banknote or check, whose so-called value requires us to forget the true nature. What is the true nature of those banknotes, of our words? He says, which is that of a piece of paper. That's it. It's a piece of paper that is generally dirty, pedarsy. This paper has passed through so many hands, and words have passed through so many uses and abuses that the most exquisite precautions are required to avoid too much confusion in our minds between what we think and seek to think and what the dictionary, the authors, and for that matter, the entire humanity or the entire human race since the beginning of language want us to think. Simply put, words carry the baggage of their pasts. You use the word in certain meaning, they use the word in certain meanings. Those meanings are not lost. They are carried, they are the dirt on that paper. And it is social convention that gives our words their meaning. So basically, words have no meanings. It is social convention that gives them their particular meaning. Like for money, for example, if I have a banknote of 10 liras, for example, in the word I say, no, this is not 10 liras, this is 10 million liras by decree of my whatever. I declare that this is a banknote of 1 million liras. Would anyone take me seriously? No, but if I were the president of Turkey, or if I were the president of the Federal Reserve Bank, you would. You see what I mean? It is that power that gives who has the power to use language, has the power to set the meanings, to define what language or what words mean. Poetry as language within language. Valéry Bergson said that poetry is a third mode. Valéry said that language within language, the same thing. No, not the same thing. Valéry, I will be concluding with this. Valéry says that language of poetry is like incantation. If you use certain sounds in certain orders with certain intonations, you are creating. You are casting spells on the world. You are changing reality. When you speak, you are not just speaking, you are being. And here there is a link to Merleau-Ponty, the phenomenological point of view, whatever, the confusion of being and speaking, whatever. I guess that's it. I will move on. Spells and charms and incantations. So for him, and here you see clearly, very clearly, the effect of ancient Egyptian mythologies in these songs, because words have the power to create, words have, or magic has the power to change reality. I guess I said that poetry is becoming. Now, Paul Valéry and Bergson they are not just philosophers who discuss these points in passing about language and reality. They represent an answer to a certain kind of secularism that was rising at the end of the 20th century and at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And their answer was not to go to the metaphysical, religious domain, and not to fall into the trap of the scientific rigidity of a universal language, a language that is neutral. Language can be fragmenting, can be distorting, but with particular skill. Language can be creative and can have the ability to express our inner thoughts and very subjective realities. I think it will stop here. I think this is very much for your generous attention. Like that.
Thank you so much, Asmaa, for this amazing presentation. And I think it has the potential to stimulate many questions. And so I would like to open the floor for questions and contributions directly without losing any time. So please.
I still have 15 minutes. Good. Yeah.
Just a simple question. Thank you very much. Poetry is so creative and could be changeable. This ineffability of language, inability to some extent, then the alternative would not be silence instead of going to another.
Yeah, Wittgenstein said that. Yes, Wittgenstein said that when you cannot express it, you have to be silent. Yeah, and again, even in the linguistic study, when we talk about science, has many translations. A science in a certain specific context, with context I mean time, space, feelings, and all that, can be interpreted in many things. Yeah, those silences are very meaningful. We have the word blind or deafening silence. Yeah, how can silence be deafening?
There is also another saying, جواب الأحمق سكوته.
Say it was speaking. No, I think so.
Okay.
Yes, I have, it's not really questions, but remarks. The fact that you combine Bergson and Valéry reminds me of the critics from the cutbook at the beginning of the 30s in the Turkish case, where they put together Bergson and Valéry as French school and as in the second remark is from an exchange in the Turkish journal, where him Israeli are talking together, and there is a poetic transposition of Bergson's philosophy. I can just read a little passage. Hayat ile ikileşir, feden olur, ruh olur, şuur ile ikileşir, zihni olur, istek olur, zihin ile ikileşir, içe döner, döner, and so on and so on. Yeah. And there are many, trends of transposing Bergson's philosophy, considered as a scientific philosophy, into poetry. And the idea that it is both scientific and poetic. It was just, reaction.
To tell you, en fait, ça me passe, because I'm not really a Bergson scientist or Bergson specialist.
Yeah, it was just.
I have no idea about his scientific writings. Mm-hmm. So my readings, to be too honest, have been limited or focused on his views of duration and to be able to understand his views of language, and then from language on his poetry. So I cannot compare his scientific writing to his poetical writing, but I can say one thing. He had a peculiar, excellent fusion of the two. He said that why should you separate them? And we see this in Sigmund, the sociologist. Sigmund. In his style of writing, he combined that rigidity of scientific practicity with the creativity of metaphorical language. So we said, instead of having that sociology, I'm just taking sociology as an example of the social science, as a rigid domain of science, as a rigid discipline. No, who said, and I have written a paper studying the history of sociology and literature, how the literary and the social analysis of society has gone hand into hand, or hand in hand, till the 19th century. Before the 19th century, almost all the writers have used creative language in scientific language. Mm-hmm. So we don't see the separation until the 19th century. And the 19th century particularly because sociologists were afraid to use literature to be not taken seriously. So to be taken seriously, they said we should have facts, we should have rigid methods that can be tested in the lab. And we cannot test human science in the lab. For scientific research, yes.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that we can say that the language was different before.
It was.
And
at least from what I have found. Yeah. If I can find, I can tell you something. I think I have the paper on my laptop. There is a section which says the last scientific writer, he is French, who was the one who was loaded, who was so thanked for his creative use of language, and also the same to be severely criticized for that specific reason. If I can't find that, yes, this is the paper. Let me see.
While you were looking for it, I knew it's a matter of theories of science. Epistemological theories of what is science and what is not. So before, of course, we have a sort of structuration during the 19th century around the categories of science, of religion, of poetry. But this does not, I think this does not mean that we can really talk about what was science before it was also poetry and so on. I don't know if I can explain my point. And it depends on the universities, different knowledge universities. In theology, it was not exactly the same. In Montauk, it was not exactly the same. In and the idea that the language is supposed to reproduce the idea of something that is real, yes, is something that before even the 19th century has completely, disconnected some people, such as Descartes, for instance, from other types of writings.
What did Descartes say?
Descartes, about the language and the reason, method, language, reason. And the idea, it's a question of what, how the language can be, in French, it's, no, I don't have it for you. How the language is supposed to tell the reality.
We have, generally, from the beginning, from ancient Egyptians and ancient religions to the present, we can take a certain spectrum. At one extreme of that spectrum, we have those who say that language is just a neutral medium. This is the thought. This is the view of the primacy of thought over language. Here we have the most famous example, the easiest example to see is Plato. So language is just a copy of the works. So language is inherently distorted. It is not, it cannot be, how shall I put it? It cannot be a neutral medium. Okay, so we said that thought perceives language, but we can manipulate language to express that one. But thought is the first step. On the other extreme, we have someone like, the most simple example I can think of is Heidegger, who said, we don't speak language, language speaks us. So it is language that creates our thoughts.
It is prior.
Exactly. So our thoughts have no importance in front of language. So it is language that really determines what we think. And here, the Sapir-Whorf, if you have heard, anyone of you is English, the Sapir-Whorf here, which says that the categories of language determine thought. But again, Sapir and Whorf are also nuanced because they did the third Whorfian theory, which says that the effect or the influence is mutual. Thought shapes language, and language also shapes thought. If we see this, we have this extreme of Plato, this extreme of Heidegger, between them the third Whorfianism, we see that we cannot determine through one clear-cut answer the relationship between languages. Although personally, I totally agree with the third Whorfianism.
It's a theory, it's not political question. And
but some think that no, language is just a medium. You can express anything by English. Frege will be
So one question and then continue with
okay.
the rest.
Oh yes, I found that. Was the code for I finished? Yeah.
You found?
Yes, I found it.
Yeah.
It was Buffon. Buffon was the author. Buffon was the last scholar whose reputation was founded on his talent for presentation, and the first to lose his reputation because he had devoted himself too much to authorship. It was the fall of Stilo Primos, Doctrina Ultimos, which means the rise of Doctrina Primos, Stilo Ultimos. So at the beginning, it was Stilo, which means like writing, which has the priorities. And Doctrina, the thought, and the trees and whatever come later. In the 19th century, the idea was opposed. So we have the thought, and language is just a superfluous, decorative thing we can have. This is really, because I spent months studying this.
yeah,
Yeah, there was a real change in the 19th century. Exactly, yes. Yeah.
I don't think we can say something that's.
Yeah, that's specific. That's clear cut.
Yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. I agree. Yes. So, any other? Yes.
I just want to ask, perhaps I missed something usually, but what is your meaning that sense that language is poetry?
Language is poetry?
I think you said that.
No. No, we didn't say language is poetry. Maybe I don't know what you mean by that because he didn't say language is poetry. No, he said that a third mode, poetry is a third mode of expressive language, if you can say. So there is the scientific language, there is the philosophical language, and he proposed a third mode.
Okay, yeah. So I'm using verse.
Maybe if I said something and then you remember something.
For presentation, I want to ask you by doing some like in kind of Bergson. What is the relationship in your presentation between, and I think it's something question we look for, between language and life.
Okay.
Language, like distinctiveness, that here like Descartes, for logic, Kant, guidance, to say that something clear and distinct. The model was the mathematical evidence, immediate evidence of actions.
What do you mean by that? I didn't get your point. What is the relationship between it? Okay,
So then it is a classic theory. Bergson and when I speak about language, he makes I think at the end of the second introduction to Transcendence, distinction between two types of clarity. The clarity is this kind of evidence.
Okay.
Talking
Talking about the language or the content presented in the language, just to be sure, because I didn't get to your point.
And I'm talking about clarity, in which way language is clear or not.
Okay.
There's some distinction between two types of clarity: an immediate clarity, is evidence, and a clarity that is not immediate, clear, but that then brings to highlight more. And this is
I see your point. Yeah, now I see what you mean. Yeah, yeah.
also we talk about language and violence, about this or the spectrum. There's a letter that Bergson wrote to Bergsonian. It's 1909 and 1912, I don't remember, the first edition of Correspondence, in which he says Bergsonian that language is naturally done to have a mastery realities, scientific. You have to do violence to language, to read through the language and use it as art, use it
Exactly.
as poetry.
Exactly. So when you use the word art, it's a general word, because at some point you would say art in different forms. You see what I mean? Not just art in linguistic definition.
Yeah.
Art in different forms.
But there is an
Has that power.
third point that I don't know if poetry is a third way or an alternative way as a model for philosophy. Because the second half of the 19th century, spiritualist philosophy, which we can roots this institution in Bergson, changed its model before the goal of philosophy was to present scientific theory. Then it became the model of philosophy, the impression of philosophy became art and poetry in the second half of the 19th century. So, is this the third way, poetry, or is this just another model of philosophy?
Well, it said it is
When
a
you
third.
can not more seriously
From what I can understand, I am by no means an authority on Bergson, but from what I can understand, from what I have read, he said it is a third mode, which means he does not exterminate the other modes. The other modes are there, but why limit yourself to those two modes? You can have a third choice. Instead of having tea or coffee, why not water? See what I mean? So there is another choice, and that choice is often in a very different way. It's creativity, it's power of interpretability, open interpretability. Because as you said, mathematical language, that's its immediate clarity. It has one interpretation. You and I and he and she cannot have two interpretations of the same statement. Water boils at 100 Celsius degree. We cannot have two interpretations unless we are coding or doing something different.
But we have mathematical time now, so we need to have.
Well, that's up to you. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
All right.
No any other questions? Or we move?
Yeah.
If we move to the
I mean,
next area.
Go to
Thank you.